My wife has been bringing home strange meat, but before I dive into that, let me tell the story from the beginning. A few years ago, if someone had told me that the spark in Lisa's eyes would one day fade, I would have laughed in their face. Our connection seemed unbreakable, something many couples envied. I remember how, in the beginning, each dawn was a new opportunity to discover something new about each other. Our conversations were long, often lasting well into the night. But as with many good things, the flame gradually extinguished, and I barely noticed when it happened. Now, I sit at the breakfast table where there was once laughter and shared stories, staring at the newspaper without reading a single word. Lisa sits across from me, her eyes glued to her phone, as usual. The sound of cutlery clashing with the silence of the house seems louder than ever. She barely looks up at me. Maybe she's responding to a work email, or perhaps scrolling through social media, searching for something I can no longer provide. The romance is gone, and what remains between us is a cold, bland routine. The words we exchange are minimal, almost always practical, like, "Can you pass the bread?" Or, "Don't forget to stop by the laundry." I can't remember the last time we laughed together. In fact, I can't remember the last time we did anything together. The nights that were once filled with conversation and intimacy now consist of a bed that's too big, where each of us sleeps turned to our own side, as if afraid that accidental contact might break what little is left between us. I knew our marriage was in trouble, but I didn't know how to fix it. Looking at Lisa and realizing how distant we had become was a kind of pain I couldn't describe. It was as if she were a stranger living in the same house. Deep down, I wondered if she felt the same. Was she feeling like this too? Or was it just me? The first signs that something was wrong began to appear when Lisa started spending more time away from home. She had always worked hard, but lately, the hours at the office seemed to stretch late into the night. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. I attributed it to overwork, the stress she mentioned in the few conversations we still had. But as the days went by, doubt began to take root in me like a poisonous seed. I found myself frequently looking at the clock, waiting for her, and wondering what she might be doing. The excuses became vaguer, and the time spent away grew longer. The activities we used to do together, like watching a movie or going out to dinner, now seemed distant, as if they belonged to another life. And there was always an excuse: "I'm exhausted. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Maybe another day." I began to wonder if Lisa was really at work all that time. The thoughts I used to push away now consumed me. The idea that she might be seeing someone else was like a ghost haunting me. I fought against the paranoia, telling myself it was just stress talking, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was as if a part of me knew something was wrong, something I couldn't name, but that was there, in those empty spaces between us. I decided to start investigating, discreetly, of course. I knew it wasn't right, but the doubt was eating away at me. One night, while she was in the shower, I quickly looked through her phone but found nothing suspicious. However, the long hours away from home continued, and my increasingly disturbed mind began to imagine scenarios I never would have considered before. Was I becoming paranoid? Or was Lisa really hiding something from me? This uncertainty became a shadow following my every step, making me even more distant from the person I used to be, and closer to a man tormented by doubt. And the worst part was that I didn't have the courage to confront her directly. Instead, I preferred to live in this silent anguish, hoping that somehow the truth would reveal itself. I knew our marriage was on the brink of collapse, and every moment of silence between us seemed like another nail in the coffin. We couldn't go on like this, living like two strangers in the same house, avoiding any meaningful contact. I needed to do something, to talk to Lisa and try to resolve what was destroying us. Even if the conversation resulted in pain, I preferred that to the emptiness that now filled our lives. After another silent dinner, I decided it was time. I waited until Lisa finished washing the dishes, her movements automatic and devoid of any emotion. The sound of running water and the clinking of dishes seemed amplified in the quiet of the house. When she finally turned around, I gathered my courage and spoke. "Lisa, we need to talk." She hesitated for a moment, drying her hands on the towel before turning fully to face me. Her eyes were tired, as if she had been expecting this but wasn't willing to face the argument that would surely follow. "What is it now, John?" she asked, a note of exhaustion in her voice. "About us," I began, feeling the weight of the words. "About what's happening to us. We can't keep going on like this, pretending everything is fine." She sighed and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "And what do you suggest? Every time we try to talk, we end up fighting." She was right, and I knew it. Every time we tried to resolve our issues, the conversation quickly degenerated into accusations, repressed resentments, and shouting. What began as an attempt at reconciliation always ended with slammed doors and an even more suffocating silence. "I know," I admitted, trying to stay calm, "but we need to try again. I don't want this to end like this, Lisa. I still love you." These words, which once would have brought a smile to her face, now seemed to have no effect. She just looked at me, her face expressionless, as if she were trying to decide whether they were worth believing. "John, I don't know what to do," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "It seems like everything we do just makes things worse." Frustration began to bubble up inside me. Why did it seem so impossible for us to simply talk without ending up in a fight? I knew things were bad, but part of me still wanted to believe there was a way out, that we could find a way to get through this. "So, what do you suggest?" I asked, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Should we just give up?" "I don't want that, Lisa. We can still save our marriage." Lisa lowered her head, avoiding my gaze. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I wanted her to say something, anything, but I feared what might come out of her mouth. "Maybe," she began, hesitant, and I braced myself for the worst. "Maybe we should get away from here for a while. Take a break from all this. A trip, maybe." I was surprised by her suggestion. It wasn't like Lisa to suggest trips or changes in routine, especially in the midst of a crisis like this. She was always the type to face problems head-on, but now it seemed even she was looking for an escape. "A trip?" I asked, trying to hide my skepticism. "Where to?" "We could visit my grandmother," Lisa said, lifting her eyes to finally look at me. "She lives in that house in rural Michigan, remember? We always liked spending time there. Maybe it will help us reconnect." The idea seemed strange, almost surreal, given the state we were in. But at the same time, there was something about it that seemed promising. Lisa's grandmother's house had always been a quiet place, almost isolated from the world, surrounded by forests and long, deserted roads. Maybe, away from the pressures of daily life and the weight of routine, we could find a way to understand each other again. "All right," I agreed, still reluctant but willing to try anything. "Let's do it. Let's visit your grandmother." Lisa nodded, but I could see that even she was uncertain. We were pinning everything on a trip that, to me, felt like our last chance. We began discussing the practical details, but the tension still hung in the air like a shadow. I knew this trip could be decisive. It would either bring us closer together again or seal the fate of our marriage. And as much as I wanted to believe everything would work out, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something much bigger than we imagined. The road stretched out before us, an endless line cutting through the desolate horizon. The silence inside the car was almost palpable, broken only by the monotonous sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional sigh from Lisa. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as the rural Michigan landscape passed by in a blur of green and gray. I had agreed to this trip in the hope that it could be a new beginning for us. However, as we moved further away from the city and civilization dissolved into poorly maintained roads and dense forests, I began to regret it. The physical discomfort was constant. The car seat felt harder than I remembered, and my back was starting to protest. But the worst part was the emotional discomfort, a heavy feeling that settled in my chest, growing with each mile. Lisa was beside me, but she seemed more distant than ever. Her eyes were fixed on the road, but I could see in her face that her mind was miles away. Occasionally, she would adjust the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't dominated by static, but would quickly give up. Any attempt at conversation had died in the first minutes of the trip, and now we were trapped in an awkward silence that neither of us seemed willing to break. I wondered, for the 1000th time, where we went wrong. When exactly did we start losing each other? Was it when we stopped going out to dinner on Fridays? Or when our conversations shifted from plans for the future to discussions about bills and responsibilities? Maybe it was when I started bringing more work home while Lisa buried herself in her own commitments. Or perhaps the problem was deeper, something neither I nor she was ready to admit. Whatever it was, it now seemed too late to fix. This trip, which I had reluctantly agreed to, was now proving to be an impulsive and desperate decision. I didn't know if we could find a solution at Lisa's grandmother's house, but the prospect of spending entire days in that strange environment, just the two of us, was starting to make me uneasy. As I drove, I glanced to the side, observing Lisa out of the corner of my eye. She was so closed off that she seemed unreachable. The woman I knew, or thought I knew, had changed so much that now I barely recognized her. And maybe I had changed too, becoming someone she no longer wanted by her side. The atmosphere between us was dense, almost suffocating. I could feel the tension in the air, like a taut string about to snap. Every movement, every sigh, seemed loaded with meaning, and I wondered if it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. I focused on the road, trying to push these thoughts away, but they kept coming back, like an inevitable tide. The landscape around us was becoming wilder and less familiar. The trees closed in around the road, creating a natural tunnel that isolated us even more from the outside world. The feeling of entering unknown territory, both literally and emotionally, was overwhelming. The GPS indicated that we still had a few hours until we reached our destination. I could feel the fatigue accumulating in my shoulders and the base of my neck, but I knew that stopping to rest would only prolong this silent torment. Lisa didn't seem willing to start a conversation, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she might say. The minutes turned into hours, and regret solidified inside me. Perhaps it would have been better to face our problems at home, to try to resolve everything before it reached this point. But now we were here, trapped on this road that seemed to stretch endlessly, heading toward a destination that suddenly seemed more threatening than comforting. I didn't know what to expect when we finally arrived at Lisa's grandmother's house. Perhaps it would be the place we needed to reconnect, or maybe it was just another stop on the slow and inevitable descent of our relationship. Either way, there was no turning back. We were committed to this trip, to this desperate attempt to save something that, deep down, I was beginning to fear was already dead. As we drove along the winding and deserted road, a growing sense of unease took hold of me. And as much as I tried to ignore it, a part of me knew that once we crossed the threshold of that old, isolated house, things might never be the same. The narrow, bumpy road that led us to the town seemed to drag on forever. Every mile we covered deepened the sense of isolation, as if we were distancing ourselves from everything we knew and entering a place out of time. Finally, when the GPS indicated that we had arrived, what greeted us was a small, decaying town, surrounded by dense forests and dark mountains. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of the countryside, but an oppressive silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The few houses we saw as we entered were worn by time, with peeling paint and overgrown gardens. The streets were deserted, and the few shops that remained open seemed on the verge of closing down. There was something unsettling about how the town seemed to have been forgotten, left to rot in its own loneliness. The discomfort I had felt during the trip only intensified upon seeing the state of the place. Lisa, beside me, remained silent, but I could tell she was a little tense too. There was a stiffness in her shoulders, and her eyes moved from side to side, as if trying to find some trace of life in those deserted streets. "We're almost there," she finally said, her voice low, as if speaking louder might awaken something unwanted in the town. We followed the main road until we reached an old house, set apart from the rest of the buildings. Lisa's grandmother's house was exactly as I remembered, a dark wooden structure, with small windows and a porch surrounded by a wild garden, where plants grew freely, almost swallowing the structure. It was a house that always gave me the impression of being an extension of the surrounding forest, something that had grown along with nature rather than being built by human hands. I parked the car in front of the house, and for a moment we sat in silence, just looking. That place had a presence, something I could never explain. It wasn't just a house, but a point of convergence for the invisible forces that seemed to dominate the town. I always felt there was something different about Lisa's grandmother, a deep connection to the land and to things that couldn't be seen, but only felt. "Shall we?" Lisa asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I nodded, though a part of me wanted to stay in the car, as if crossing the threshold of that house meant entering a realm from which we might not emerge the same. We grabbed our bags, and I followed Lisa up to the porch. The creaking of the wooden boards beneath our feet was the only sound breaking the silence around us. Before we could knock, the door opened, revealing the figure of Lisa's grandmother. Mrs. Hargrove was a short, thin woman, with white hair tied in a loose bun. Her eyes, however, were bright and piercing, as if they could see beyond flesh and bones, straight to the soul. She opened a warm smile when she saw us, her arms extended to Lisa, who immediately hugged her. "Lisa, my dear, I'm so glad you arrived safely," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice soft and comforting. She stepped back from Lisa and looked at me, still smiling, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy, as if she knew something I didn't. Even so, I approached and offered a handshake, which she quickly turned into a hug, as if trying to dispel any discomfort. "John, dear, it's so good to see you too. Come in. Come in. Let's get you comfortable." We entered the house, and the air inside was heavy, filled with the scent of dried herbs and aged wood. The decor was the same as always, with old furniture, worn rugs, and shelves full of books and strange objects that seemed to belong to another era. Everything there seemed frozen in time, as if the world outside had changed, but that house had remained unchanged. "I hope the trip wasn't too tiring," Mrs. Hargrove said as she led us to the living room, where a lit fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls. "It was a bit long, but we're fine," Lisa replied, though I could see she was feeling a bit uncomfortable too. The grandmother observed us for a moment, as if studying our expressions, and then her smile widened. "Well, you must be hungry. I've prepared something for us to eat. In the meantime, you can rest here." She left us alone in the living room, and I sat in one of the armchairs trying to relax, but feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the fatigue from the trip or the weight of the unresolved tensions between me and Lisa, but there was something else, something in the atmosphere of the town, of the house, that made me uneasy. It was as if a shadow was present, something subtle but beginning to creep into my mind. Lisa sat on the sofa without saying anything, and I looked at the crackling fire in the fireplace, trying to push away the feeling that we had entered a place where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. That place was different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, as warm as Lisa's grandmother's reception was, something was wrong, something that would eventually be revealed, whether we were ready for it or not. The first sign that something was truly wrong came the next morning. I woke up before dawn, with a vague but insistent discomfort that I couldn't explain. Lisa was still sleeping beside me, breathing softly, but there was a tension in her face even in rest. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and left the room, determined to clear my mind. Mrs. Hargrove's house was immersed in a deep silence, interrupted only by the occasional creak of aged wood. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my feet, and found myself in the living room, where the fireplace was still crackling, as if it had never been put out. It was strange to think that, even in such a small house, I felt lost. There was a different energy here, something that made me feel like I was being watched, even when there was no one around. I passed through the living room and made my way to the kitchen, where the morning light was beginning to filter through the dirty windows. That's when I heard voices. They were coming from outside, muffled but discernible. I went to the back door and slowly opened it, looking out into the yard where Mrs. Hargrove was talking to someone. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was Lisa. They were facing away from me, talking in low voices, as if they didn't want to be heard. Both of their postures were tense, and Lisa was gesturing with her hands, while her grandmother seemed to remain calm, responding with slow nods. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the scene sent a chill down my spine. I knew I shouldn't, but I moved closer to try to catch some fragments of the conversation. Hiding behind one of the trees that surrounded the house, I could hear a few loose words, things like, "He doesn't know," and "we need to be careful." They were talking about me, and it was clear they were hiding something. My mind immediately filled with questions. What could Lisa and her grandmother be hiding from me? Since we arrived, things hadn't seemed normal, but I had attributed that to fatigue and the tension between us. Now, I was beginning to suspect there was something more, something I wasn't seeing. After a while, their conversation ended, and the two of them went back inside the house, leaving me alone in the cold morning air. I waited until the door closed before returning to the kitchen, trying to appear as natural as possible. When Lisa walked in, I was already sitting at the table, pretending to look distractedly out the window. "Good morning," she said, forcing a smile. I could see she was trying to hide her unease, but her eyes betrayed her. "Good morning," I replied, watching her closely as she moved around the kitchen, making coffee. "You woke up early?" "Yes, I had trouble sleeping," she replied without looking at me. "I decided to take a walk outside." I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But inside, my discomfort was growing. Something was happening, something she didn't want me to know. Later, when Lisa went out with her grandmother to buy groceries, I decided to explore on my own. The town wasn't large, and with little activity, it wasn't hard to find locals willing to talk. I was determined to learn more about Lisa's family, about Mrs. Hargrove, and that strange place where they had grown up. I walked into a small convenience store, where the attendant, an elderly man with keen eyes, greeted me with a nod. The store had that musty, dusty smell common in places that rarely see new products. I started making casual conversation, mentioning that I was in town visiting my wife's grandmother. "Mrs. Hargrove?" he asked, raising his eyebrows with curiosity. "A very respected woman around here. Is your wife her granddaughter?" "Yes," I replied, trying to sound disinterested. She grew up here. Oh yes, I remember your wife when she was little. She was always very close to her grandmother. There was something in his tone that made me alert, a shadow of meaning in his words. I knew Mrs. Hargrove was a respected figure, but there was also a tone of reverence that bothered me, as if she had an influence that went beyond simple admiration. "It's a quiet town," I commented, steering the conversation, "though it seems a bit stagnant." The man gave a wry smile. "Yes, time seems to pass more slowly here. Not all young people like it. Many end up leaving. But those who stay, well, they have their reasons." "And what reasons would those be?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light but growing more interested. He gave me a long look, as if evaluating whether he should answer or not. Finally, he leaned slightly over the counter, his voice low. "Some families here have old traditions, things you don't see in other places anymore. Mrs. Hargrove, she's a guardian of those traditions. Don't get me wrong, it's nothing dangerous, but some things are better left quiet." I felt a chill. There was clearly something strange, something they didn't speak of openly. Lisa's grandmother wasn't just a respected woman, but someone who seemed to hold some kind of power or knowledge that intimidated others. I thanked him for the conversation and left the store with a sense that I was in the middle of something I didn't fully understand. Lisa and her grandmother were hiding something from me, and now, more than ever, I was determined to find out what it was. But as I made my way back to the house, a doubt began to creep into my mind. Did I really want to know the truth? The time I spent talking to the locals only intensified my suspicions, and I returned to Mrs. Hargrove's house with a heavy heart. When I walked in, I found Lisa in the kitchen, helping her grandmother prepare dinner. The two were talking in low voices, and when they saw me, their words immediately died out. The silence that followed was laden with tension, as if I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to hear. "You took a while?" Lisa commented, trying to sound casual, but there was a note of irritation in her voice. "I was getting to know the town," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I talked to some people. It's a small town, but it has its own history," Mrs. Hargrove said, not looking at me, focused on cutting vegetables. "I hope it was an enjoyable experience." "It was interesting," I murmured, not wanting to reveal that my conversations had only increased my suspicion. Something was happening here, something I wasn't understanding, and it seemed like everyone knew except me. Lisa cast a quick glance at her grandmother, as if seeking confirmation of something, and then turned to me with a weary expression. "Can we talk, John?" I nodded, feeling that whatever came next wouldn't be good. I followed Lisa to the small room we were staying in. She closed the door behind us, and the air seemed to grow heavier. "You're not acting like yourself," she began bluntly. "Since we got here, you've been strange, suspicious. Maybe it's because I'm trying to understand what's going on," I retorted, frustration starting to overflow. "Lisa, you and your grandmother are hiding something from me. I know there are secrets in this family, things no one wants to talk about." She looked at me, surprised, and then her expression hardened. "You're letting your imagination take you to the wrong places, John. This is all just superstition and small-town rumors." "Superstition?" My voice rose before I could control it. "Lisa, ever since we got here, nothing seems normal. The way people talk about your grandmother, the way you've been acting. Don't tell me it's just my imagination." She crossed her arms, defensive, and moved away as if she needed space to process my words. "I knew coming here would be difficult for you," she finally said, her voice lower but still firm. "But I thought you would at least try to understand." "Understand what, Lisa?" I asked, exasperated. "You barely talk to me since we got here, and when you do, it feels like you're hiding something." How can I understand if you don't tell me anything? She bit her lower lip, a gesture I recognized as hesitation but also repressed anger. It's not easy for me either, John. This place brings back memories. And some things, yes, are hard to explain. But that doesn't mean I'm hiding something from you. I laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Then explain it to me, Lisa, because from where I stand, it feels like I'm getting further and further away from you, as if I'm losing you to something I can't see. You never understood this place, she responded, her voice sharp. You never understood what my grandmother means to me or to this town. You think everything comes down to logic and reason, but some things can't be explained that way. Maybe it's because those things don't make sense. I exploded, unable to contain myself. Maybe it's because we're getting ourselves into something that shouldn't be part of our lives. And maybe, just maybe, I'm worried because the woman I love is slipping away from me, burying herself in secrets and mysteries that seem to be destroying us. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lisa looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes, sadness or maybe regret. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by a mask of coldness. I'm not going to discuss this with you, she said, her voice now flat, almost distant. Believe what you want, but I won't let your paranoia ruin this. This trip was supposed to help us, John. If you can't understand that, then maybe we shouldn't have come. I wanted to shout, to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched as she walked away, leaving the room and leaving me alone, suffocated by a mix of anger and frustration. When I finally left the room, the house was bathed in a strange calm. I knew something was breaking between us, something we might never be able to fix. The tension that had existed between us since the town had intensified, turning into a barrier that seemed impossible to overcome. I sat in the living room, my head buried in my hands. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, but its warmth couldn't thaw the cold that had settled within me. Something was slipping away, escaping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. And the worst part? I was beginning to fear that Lisa no longer wanted to be found. The days that followed that argument felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Lisa and I barely exchanged words, and when we did, the conversations were superficial, almost mechanical. The tension in the house was palpable, but there was something else in the air, an invisible presence that seemed to watch every move, every breath. And more, I felt I was alone on this journey, trying to unravel a mystery that Lisa refused to share. It was during one of those stifling mornings when the air seemed too heavy to breathe that I noticed something strange. I was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly drinking coffee while trying to plan my next steps, when I noticed a brown paper bag in a corner of the counter. The bag was crumpled, but what caught my attention was the faint smell emanating from it. Something I couldn't immediately identify, but that caused me instinctive discomfort. Curious and a bit suspicious, I approached and opened the bag. Inside, I found packages wrapped in wax paper. When I opened them, I discovered cuts of meat, but they weren't like the ones I was used to seeing. The color was slightly darker, with a grayish hue that didn't seem normal, and the smell was strong, almost metallic, something that made me recoil immediately. What intrigued me even more was the simple label attached to one of the packages. There was no store or butcher's name, just a handwritten word, "Special." The handwriting was familiar, probably Mrs. Hargrove's. The initial discomfort gave way to a deeper sense of unease. This didn't seem right. I remembered the whispered conversations between Lisa and her grandmother, the townspeople's words about old traditions, and a disturbing idea began to form in my mind. What if this meat was related to the secrets everyone seemed to avoid mentioning? I decided I needed to confront Lisa about it. I waited until her grandmother left for her customary morning walk around the property. And then I looked for Lisa, finding her in the living room, absorbed in an old book that seemed to have been taken directly from the dusty shelves of the house. "Lisa, I need to talk to you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the unease I felt. She looked up from the book, and for a brief moment, a shadow of fatigue crossed her face. "What is it now, John?" "It's about this meat," I began, placing the package on the table in front of her. "Where did you get this?" She looked at the package and then at me, her expression closed. "My grandmother brought it." "Why?" "Because this doesn't seem normal, Lisa. The smell, the color, and this label," I added, pointing to the word special. "What does it mean? Where did this meat come from?" Lisa sighed, closing the book with a brusque gesture. "John, you're overreacting. It's just meat, fresh meat my grandmother gets from a local farmer. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't look like ordinary meat, Lisa," I insisted, trying to hold back my frustration. "And you know it. I'm starting to believe it has something to do with these secrets you and your grandmother are hiding." "I already told you, John. There are no secrets." Her voice rose, a mixture of exasperation and something that seemed close to desperation. "This is all in your head. You're looking for problems where there are none." "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Tell me where this meat comes from. Why does it look so different? Why does this entire town seem to be stuck in some kind of silent pact?" For a moment, I thought she was going to answer me, that she would finally come clean. But instead, Lisa shook her head, her eyes filling with a sadness that hit me like a punch to the gut. "I can't, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't explain because you wouldn't understand. And if you keep insisting on this, it will only make things worse." That was the last straw. The anger I had been trying to control exploded, and before I could stop myself, I shouted, "Worse? Lisa, how could this get worse? We barely speak, barely look at each other. And now you're telling me there are things I simply shouldn't understand? I'm your husband, and this is destroying us." She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I saw the Lisa I knew, the woman I married, scared and lost. But then something inside her hardened again, and when she spoke, it was with a cold, almost indifferent voice. "John, if you keep insisting on this, I don't know what will happen to us. Maybe it's better if you go home. Maybe it's better for both of us." Those words hit me like a blow, and I stood there, speechless. Lisa got up and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and with the bag of meat that now seemed much more sinister. I was losing Lisa, and maybe myself as well, to this mystery that surrounded her family and that town. And the more I tried to uncover, the more distant she became. But there was one thing I knew for sure. No matter how far I had to go, I wouldn't give up on finding the truth. And with that determination, I began to plan my next step, even knowing it could lead us to a point of no return. The silence between Lisa and me became unbearable after our last argument. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, as if the walls were soaked with secrets that shouldn't be revealed. The words left unsaid hovered over us like a storm ready to break. I knew I needed to confront her again, and this time, I wouldn't accept evasions or half-truths. I waited until nightfall, when Lisa's grandmother had already retired to her room, and the darkness enveloped the house, turning it into an even more oppressive place. Lisa was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, staring at the fire in the fireplace as if it could give her the answers she was seeking. The flames danced in her eyes, but her expression was one of deep sadness, as if she was preparing for something inevitable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. She didn't turn to look at me, but I saw her shoulders tense. John, please. No, Lisa. I'm not going to accept this lack of answers anymore. I interrupted, approaching and stopping beside the sofa. I deserve to know the truth. You know something's wrong here, and I need to understand what's going on. She sighed, still avoiding my gaze. I didn't want it to be like this. Then please, tell me what's going on. I insisted, trying to keep my voice calm but feeling frustration bubbling under the surface. Tell me what this town, your family, and that damn meat have to do with all this. I'm trying to save what's left of our marriage, but you're leaving me in the dark. Finally, Lisa turned to look at me. Her eyes were full of a mix of sadness and resignation, as if she had carried this burden for too long. Everything I'm going to tell you, you have to promise you'll try to understand. I promise, I responded without hesitation. But inside, a part of me feared what she was about to reveal. She stood up from the sofa and began to pace around the room, as if she needed to move to organize her thoughts. My grandmother and this town, they're not what you think, John. It's not just an isolated community stuck in time. There's something deeper, something that's been kept secret for generations. My mind started racing with possibilities. Ancient legends, macabre rituals, everything seemed plausible in that atmosphere. Lisa, what are you talking about? She stopped, her back to me, looking at the fireplace. That meat you found, it's not from ordinary animals, John. It's part of a pact that my family made a long time ago. A pact with something that lives in the forests around the town. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. A pact? You're saying your family, that my family sacrificed a lot to keep this place protected, she completed, turning to me with tears in her eyes. The pact involves offering meat, human meat, John. The outsiders who disappear, the travelers who never return. They're the offering. The shock hit me with the force of a punch, leaving me breathless. I tried to process what she was saying, but the mere idea was unbearable. This is insane, Lisa. You're killing people. No, it's not like that, she quickly said, trying to calm me down. We're not the ones who kill, but they are. Those who live in the forest. They demand the meat, and in return, the town is protected. Those who disappear are taken by them. What you're saying is that your family, your grandmother, is involved in this. That you knew the whole time and didn't tell me? My voice began to tremble with indignation and disbelief. She nodded, crying now. I never wanted you to know, John. I wanted to protect you from this madness, but now you're here and I can't hide the truth anymore. The reason we came, my grandmother believes it's time to pass the burden on to me, that I must continue the pact. And you accepted that? I yelled, unable to contain my anger. You knew what was happening and still brought us here? I had no choice, she yelled back, her voice desperate. John, if we don't follow the pact, the entire town will be destroyed. They'll come and no one will escape. I can't let that happen. I stepped back, feeling the weight of what she was telling me. The woman I loved was involved in something indescribably horrible, something I could never have imagined. And now I was trapped in that nightmare with her. John? Lisa approached, tears streaming down her face. I love you, and I never wanted you to be involved in this. I wanted this trip to help us, but now I see it only made things worse. I looked at her, torn between the love I still felt and the horror of what she had revealed. Part of me wanted to run, to leave that place and never look back. But the other part, the part that still saw the woman I married, knew that running wasn't an option. Not while she was trapped in that cycle of horror. Lisa, I don't know what to do, I whispered, my voice breaking. How can I stay after knowing this? She didn't answer, just hugged me, and I felt that she was as lost as I was. We were trapped in a nightmare, and the only thing left was to decide whether we would face it together or let everything fall apart. The fire in the fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls as if the darkness itself was mocking our pain. I was torn between love and terror, between the desire to save what was left of our marriage and the urge to flee to save my own sanity. But one thing was certain: there was no turning back. What Lisa had revealed changed everything, and now I had to decide whether to keep fighting by her side, or if this was the end of the line for both of us. The night was enveloped in almost absolute darkness, as if the sky itself refused to witness what was about to happen. Lisa and I were in the small living room of her grandmother's house, the flames of the fireplace casting restless shadows around us. Each crackle of the burning would seem like a warning, a reminder of the gravity of what was at stake. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my head in my hands, trying to process everything Lisa had revealed. The truth was more than disturbing. It was something that defied comprehension. The idea of an ancient pact of beings in the forest demanding human sacrifices was the kind of thing you only find in nightmares or horror stories. And yet, it was the reality Lisa presented to me. Lisa stood a few steps away from me, watching me with a mix of anxiety and sadness. I knew she was waiting for a decision, something that would define not just the future of our relationship but her own life, and possibly the entire town. "John, I know this is too much," she began, her voice trembling. "But I can't do this alone. I need you. If you stay, we could try to find a way to face this together. Maybe there's a way to break this cycle." I lifted my head and looked at her, feeling the weight of what she was asking. Staying meant more than just supporting Lisa. It meant accepting the horror of what she had told me. It meant getting involved in something that could destroy my soul. But leaving would mean abandoning the woman I loved, leaving her alone to deal with an unbearable burden. "And if there's no way to break this cycle?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What if we're trapped in this nightmare forever, Lisa?" She hesitated, and then her eyes filled with tears. "Then, at least we'd be together. At least we'd have each other to face it." The room seemed to close in around us, the walls closing in as I weighed my options. My mind screamed to run, to escape all of this and never look back. But my heart was broken, torn between the desire to save myself and the need to protect Lisa, to be by her side no matter what. Time seemed to stretch infinitely as I struggled with this decision. Finally, I stood up and walked over to Lisa. She looked at me with pleading eyes, waiting, fearing the answer I would give. I can't do this, Lisa," I whispered, the pain evident in my voice. "I can't live knowing what's happening here, knowing that we're involved in this. I'm sorry." She took a step back as if my words were a physical blow. The sadness on her face turned to despair. "John, please." But I was already decided. "I love you, Lisa, but I can't. I need to go. I need to save myself before this destroys me completely." The sound of the silence that followed was deafening. Lisa closed her eyes, tears streaming freely down her face. I knew I was breaking her heart, but I also knew that staying would mean destroying mine. "If you decide to stay, I understand," I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I can't be part of this anymore. I'm sorry." She said nothing, just looked at me for a long moment before slowly turning and leaving the room. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house until I heard the bedroom door close, leaving me alone with the dying fire in the fireplace. I stood there for a long time, feeling the emptiness that my decision had created. But deep down, I knew there was no other choice. I needed to leave, to escape that place before it swallowed me whole. And so, with a heavy heart and a wounded soul, I began to pack my things, preparing to leave Lisa and everything I loved behind. The morning came cold and silent, as if nature itself was mourning. I put my bags in the car, trying to avoid looking at the house, at the place where I had left the woman I still loved. Lisa didn't come to say goodbye, and I knew it was better that way. Our goodbyes had already been said the night before. I drove along the empty, winding roads, leaving behind the town and its dark secrets. Each mile that took me away from the place seemed to lighten the weight I carried, but the emptiness in my chest remained, like an open wound that refused to heal. When I got home, everything seemed strange, as if I was returning to a life that no longer belonged to me. The furniture, the photos, the small details of our home, everything reminded me of Lisa, and everything reminded me of what I had lost. The days that followed were a constant struggle to find a new normal. I went back to work, tried to resume the routine, but there was a part of me that had stayed in that town, trapped in the shadows of secrets I would never be able to forget. The nights were the worst. Closing my eyes meant reliving the memories, seeing Lisa's face, hearing her words, and wondering if I had made the right choice. Sometimes I thought about calling her, asking how she was, if she had managed to escape the fate that awaited her. But something inside me held back, a voice whispering that it was better to leave the past where it was, that trying to relive those memories would only bring more pain. And so, the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. I tried to rebuild my life, met new people, made new friends, but there was always an empty space, a gap that no one could fill. Lisa had been more than just my wife. She had been my companion, my support, and now that she was gone, I felt incomplete, as if a part of me was forever missing. But over time, the pain began to soften. Life went on as it always does, and I began to accept that some things were beyond my control. I would never forget Lisa or the dark secrets surrounding her family, but I learned to live with it, to carry that weight without letting it destroy me. There were moments when I still wondered what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had chosen to fight by her side. But those questions were useless. What was done was done. All that was left was to move forward one step at a time. I never went back to that town. I never sought to know what happened to Lisa or her grandmother. Maybe that was cowardice, or maybe it was simply the only way to survive. But wherever she was, I hoped that Lisa had found peace, one way or another. And I hoped, quietly, that one day I would find mine too. And if you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and take a look at the next story playing on the screen.